All right, you ready for me to go? Okay. Welcome everyone. Pooja, alerted me that this is our second to the last council meeting. So welcome everyone to the second to the last. That's crazy to even think about. It seems like yesterday that we started. So I'm happy to have you all here and excited about what we can do moving forward here. Um, we have already gotten a lot of work done, but we do have some more essential things that we need to discuss today. So I'm excited to dig into that today, both about licensure and implementation, which are our two remaining charges for the council. We're going to have some time today to discuss recommendations for both of those things. And hopefully, if we get a quorum toward the end of the session, we can vote on some of those recommendations. The first thing we're going to do today is talk a little bit about licensure recommendations. I requested in between meetings that we get a little bit of data on what other states do and that sort of thing. And so I am going to turn it over to Melissa Goff, who's going to share some of that data that was collected by some of the staff.
Hi there, everybody. There is a link in the agenda if you want to follow that, but I will also share my screen. I don't see it. Oh, there it is. Where? And hopefully you're all seeing something with the blue top that says Pearson, kind of right in the middle, Pearson test.
Yep.
All right. Excellent. So what the team here did was, and I know that the request when it was made with the understanding that, gosh, you won't be able to get all the states, but the team did a pretty good job of getting thorough information related to what literacy assessments are currently being administered in different states for licensure. So I'm just going to walk across the top of this for you, and all the states, of course, are listed on the left-hand side, but I want you to know what's in the spreadsheet and then perhaps have a moment so that you can answer any questions that you have related to that. And I'm actually going to move this so I can look at it a little more easily with my blind eyes. So one of the things that we discussed in the last meeting and prior as well was concerns related to the Interstate Mobility Compact. And so we've listed in this document whether or not a state is in that compact agreement with us. If you remember, just to make sure that you know, states who are part of the Interstate Mobility Compact have agreed to recognize each other's licenses. We haven't yet got to the point where that reciprocal agreement is in place, but it is a group of states who are working together to try and identify how do we do this in a way that that doesn't penalize teachers, but also upholds state standards related to expectations of the skill sets of their educators.
Melissa, we're not seeing the spreadsheet anymore
Oh,
on our screen.
does that help?
Yep, that's it.
That is so weird. Okay. Hold on, then I'm going to move the camera and I have to get my slow eyeballs up close. There you go. So then this next column, high volume impact state, and you may want to make yourself a little note of this. This is just saying, do these folks get a ton of applications running through their state agency or not? And that can be based upon frequency of renewals. That's a large part of it, but can also be based upon population of the state and just simple math numbers. Then we have a couple of columns related to which tests are required. So this is the Education Testing Service test. This lists the name of if that test is offered or as a requirement for licensure, it is listed in this column. If it is not, then it just says none. But you'll notice there are different titles listed. So one state, Alabama, for example, has the Reading Specialist 530 test. That is a particular test, and the number itself differentiates it from, when we look at Alaska, the Teaching Reading Elementary 5205 or Teaching Reading K through 12 5206. So not all tests are the same. And I think we sometimes just do a quick look to see if they have a reading test. But what we know is the teaching of reading at younger ages is approached differently than the more conceptual challenges that older students may be having. And so when we're looking at these assessments, that will be a part of what the team is doing in these next steps post your work. Then you can see the cost, of the ETS test. And what it doesn't say in these columns is whether that cost is a burden of the educator or if it's a burden of the state. And that is not consistent. The next group of tests are by Pearson, which is you've probably heard of Pearson before, and not dissimilarly, it's a list of those tests that are offered by their title and the number associated with them. And then the Pearson test costs. This is whether or not states require an early literacy assessment. And we had the discussion related to standardized testing and whether or not that is the only assessment that we want to be using for this. And we know that best practice really looks at multiple forms of assessment in order to demonstrate proficiency. So you can see here that some states require some endorsements, and then there are others that don't require any literacy assessment, and some that absolutely do require. If we look at this one, for example, this is Indiana requires the state assessment. And in this case, that would be the ETS test that was listed. Then we have a number of links if you're really wanting to go more deeply for you to get in and look a little bit, look at some details around each state and what their requirements are. The competency here, this means that when somebody gets their license, how is it indicated on records so that people understand what that competency indicates. And in almost all the states, it's an endorsement label, such as reading specialist, or in this case, we've talked about K-5 elementary teachers requiring this, correct? And so that would be the endorsement that's listed. And then this last column indicates when the assessment is required. So does everybody who completes an EPP need to take the test? Is it just applicants from other states? Is it only for specific endorsement areas? So that is all covered in that column. And I would just point out that it is interesting to the cost coverage piece that we do see states where the licensees have no costs associated with their licensure, as states such as Hawaii, Nevada, where the legislature covers all of those costs and which means that the folks who are doing licensing and doing investigations, those roles are all paid for by the legislature. So they're not reliant upon fees for folks. You can't to understand the impact of the fees for the test taking, you also need to understand the fees that applicants are also having in association with their license, in applying for their license. So I just want it to be clear that these costs are simply the cost that the testing organization charges. That's that fee. And we have programs like we have had the diverse license expense reimbursement that has helped educators pay for some of the costs associated with their licensing fees in the past. And so it's something to consider as you look at some of these more expensive tests. I think Idaho actually pays for all of their tests, and I believe it's the Praxis test it's listed. But so candidates don't have to pay for that exam. Let's see. No, it's ETS. So that is the document, and I welcome any questions. I know it's a lot to digest.
I just had one question. When those tests that are listed, we don't know for sure for each state what endorsements those, like, it may not be an elementary ed candidate that is having to take some of those tests. It might be like a reading endorsement.
Correct.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah, correct, Chair Fritz. I think, and actually, I think oftentimes that is how it started out in all of our states, right? It's begun as only a requirement around the reading specialist endorsement. We just didn't have the time to go through and list all of those for you.
Yeah, for sure. Anyone else have questions?
I was wondering that same thing because I mean, the reading specialist 5302 is the one that Oregon has for the reading endorsement. And so I'm just trying to understand for these, like, because that's a big difference, because here, right, people go back, they add on the endorsement. And so I guess I'm wondering right now and looking at this, like, those are two separate things, and I would think we would keep them two separate things because there are a host of things with the reading specialist around providing PD and the ILA standards that we would want to keep separate in Oregon. And so it would be helpful to know, because that really matters, because what just they would need for the elementary education. So we also make sure we are not combining those, right, in Oregon. Because it noted for so many of them endorsement, and typically an endorsement is an add-on, not a license. But when I was looking at that K column, right, it seems that they almost all are endorsements. And so I'm just curious, like, what is actually required for the K-5 licensure?
So if you look at column L, that helps a little bit more. It does list, Katie, a number of those areas, endorsement areas, or if they're a license, if it's required for the license. So you'll get a better feel for that. It just isn't what this chart doesn't do for you is give you a 1-for-1, which is here, who is required to take Foundations of Reading 190. Which of these endorsements, for example, would be required and which would not. Julie?
I'm curious, what exactly is the difference between being called a reading, getting a reading endorsement, and being called like a reading interventionist or a literacy, I guess, reading interventionist or literacy specialist? It seems like there are a bunch of different titles that are used across different states.
Yeah, that's a great question. And though I can't give you the specific definition that different states would have, I can say that in my experience, a literacy specialist, a reading specialist, those folks have specialized training in the acquisition of literacy skills in order to read, write, and communicate beyond what the typical elementary teacher would have, or beyond at times what a special educator may have. So they get much deeper into not only the skill set of teaching reading and those building blocks, but they also get into what are common learning differences that students have, such as now is in our dyslexia standards, but prior was not. And so a reading specialist would better understand that than your typical educator. So those are different names, but I would say that in my experience, they do very similar jobs.
I have a quick question. My Zoom updated, so I'm not sure how to raise my hand anymore. So I'm just do it the old fashioned way. My question is, do you see us like making recommendations to TSBC or TSBC on their own, kind of taking this document, having a list of states where you're just like, yep, this would definitely. And then so I came personally from Massachusetts, so I know I had to take a huge test, and then I did a reciprocity, and then I had like a certain amount of time to fulfill Oregon requirements. So do you see in the future where we would look at certain states and know that their requirements matched ours, and so they would just be able to get the reciprocity, or like a flow chart of pathways?
Yeah, the challenge with the reciprocity is that each state changes their standards on such a at such different paces that maintaining a spreadsheet that really well captures what each state does is going to be the greatest challenge. And so one of our ahas in going through the process was really the mobility compact folks are going to need to have some very difficult conversations around expectations across districts in early literacy, for example. And then when we're looking at reciprocity, that is not guaranteed, such as through the compact, but rather reciprocity that is requested for state folks who are out of state. Without that, we look at, well, what have you done? And so we are looking at which test did they take and what did they score? We are looking at that separately because we cannot assure ourselves of the requirements in that individual state when that individual received their license. So that's really where things are challenging. I think as we look to build what our requirements will be, I really, our team has been very impressed with Colorado. We've been very impressed with some of the folks that we've met with already. And we would be taking the lead from those who are out in front of us a little bit and who not only understand the implementation of the science of reading, but understand, approach that with a cultural competency as well. I don't see any other questions. But if you realize you have questions after the meeting, just email me. I'll put my email in the chat. Feel free to email me and I'll get the right person to answer you. Julie.
Melissa, does it look like California is the only one whose test requires video? Is that what I'm seeing? Like
I
video-
think that's the only one that I saw as well, Julie. Someone else might find it, but I was really struck by that with California. And I actually, my first question was, how do they do that?
Right.
How do they manage the sheer number of reviews that you would need to do, right?
and then look at the cost associated with it.
Right.
Cost.
The speed readers cannot get through a video faster, right? You're still having to go more slowly. So I thought that was really interesting to see, and I'd love to learn more about that because I also think, gosh, that would be fantastic to be able to actually watch people in practice.
Melissa, I had one other clarifying question. With the states that we will have reciprocity with, if they don't have something implemented around that, that license that we would automatically have to give them is good for 1 year and then they have to renew. So we would have the opportunity then to have them pass that.
Well, the language of the compact says that we will, of the compact, so just speaking to that agreement, says that we will accept any license and give the equivalent license to that individual in Oregon. And so there's going to be a lot of conversation about equivalency as the compact lead group sets the expectations because we are certainly in different places around literacy. Mm-hmm. And I think for some of us, we are going to see some real challenges to meet the expectations of the compact as it's currently designed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I was just thinking about the conversation we had before in terms of who and how we handle the out-of-state applicants. Because obviously we want to know that those teachers are competent and ready to teach our kids to read. So I'm just kind of wondering how we work with the compact, but still have our high expectations for teacher performance.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. We have discussed, there are many options, length of an individual license, but also do we set the marker if someone's coming in on a preliminary that for their professional, they would have to show, demonstrate that. So which would give them a longer timeline. They'd still be in with kids, but we could at least give them an equivalent license. So, but we are a long ways from setting anything in writing, let alone in stone.
Okay.
Melissa, I had one more question. I actually don't know if it's for you or if someone else knows, but how often and when is the Orilla updated, right? Because there are, um,
Not a question for me, Katie. I'm so
that
sorry.
would just be, I mean, it would be
We can
because of the
find that out.
that everyone has to take already. And I'm just curious about, you know, either when it's updated or like possibilities of updating, just as we think about things to do, being very aware of cost to candidates. It seems that if we already have something that they're taking, could we better align that?
I think that's a great question. Thank
Or
you.
make that shorter, just take literacy out of there. I mean, I feel like I want us to have that in mind as we're thinking about this. Just looking at the lengths of some of the tests.
Right.
I totally agree.
And sorry to ask you, I was like, I just don't know who the go-to for that is.
Oh, no, no.
Actually
You
runs-
ask me,
I was
I'm the
trying
one
to look
talking.
on
I'm
their
the one talking
website.
about assessments. Yeah.
I was like looking on the website to see like who is it that determines all of this.
And I would add that we are going to need to have multiple ways for people to demonstrate their competence in this area. And so I do think it would behoove us, especially given the numbers of people that we're going to be trying to get licensed under this requirement, it would behoove us to have standardized assessments that can take a bulk of folks. Recognizing though that standardized assessments are not going to take everybody who's competent. And so how do we give alternate pathways to individuals to demonstrate that?
Yeah.
And
And
I
also
think,
looking at the formats of the standardized tests themselves and part of the choosing, are there's some
Yeah.
that, yeah,
Yeah.
be more accessible to English learners and such.
and I still am really curious how other professions handle licensure testing and alternatives to that, so that we maybe can get some guidance from other areas such as speech language,
Yeah,
like, those kinds of professions. Well, as far as that goes, any profession, how they do that. Because I know we already have in place accommodations for students with disabilities.
right.
But what does that look like across other professions and beyond that?
Yeah, well, I had to pass a school psych test and it was just a standard test. I'm thinking there weren't really a lot of provisions for native speakers.
Mm-hmm.
Or alternatives either, I don't think.
Right. Yeah. Well, Melissa, thank you so much. And thank you to your team. That was a lot of work and really gave us some good information to chew on and help us think about, how we want to approach this recommendation. Is there anything else we need to do before we move on to that discussion?
No, I think we're good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate that information. So we are going to go forward and discuss some draft recommendations. You should have had in the materials, I'm trying to find the right pile of paper, that were related to some ideas for recommendations for licensure. And you did talk about this in the work group meeting, which I wasn't able to be there for. But there were 3 different questions, like which educators have to meet the requirements, when do they have to meet them, and then what evidence do we recommend that TSBC accept to meet those literacy requirements. So based on that conversation, there is a draft, and did somebody put that in the chat? Oh, good work. Thanks, Pooja. All right. And so based on that discussion, this draft recommendation came out. We need to review that and discuss that in breakout rooms. We'll come back to the full group after for review and key takeaways from that group. Let's see. so the instructions are to go question by question. There are 4 different questions. Discuss the pros and cons of those various recommendations and think about which you'd want to propose the council adopt as recommendations. And then your group in breakout should decide on a council member or members to report back to the larger discussion group. And we'll have 5 minutes each to report out. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about what you're going to share. And I think Kristen's going to put those instructions in the chat for us if she hasn't already. And we will head off to breakout rooms.
Everybody coming back? Hello.
Welcome back, Co-Chair Gardner. Good to see you.
Sorry, everybody. I'm
No worries.
trying to do a couple different things at once, as I'm sure we all are. All right. So we had a couple of breakouts and we were going to do some report back. So why don't we start with group 2?
We got to everything except landing who's going to share. So I'm going to throw it to the group to see who's feeling in the moment who'd like to share. It could be a group effort, and we have the notes to reference.
I'm not. Thanks, Melissa.
I pledge, I pledge to speak. I don't have my notes in front of me, but what I will share is that it seemed, oh, there we go. I just had to move all of you. In general, we leaned toward everybody needs to have this expertise if they are working with students who are learning to read. So, and we had conversation, so you can kind of see that through 1, 2, 3, and 4. So everybody, when they renew their when they get their next license, whatever that license would be, following the date of implementation for EPPs, so that we have where everybody's kind of on that same pathway. We also talked about we had good legislative support by our legislators who are in the call to support this financially and to really invest in ways that can make a difference. So we talked about deployment of professional learning through our ESDs to support those licensees who are currently already in Oregon classrooms. And that approach had a lot of resonance on the team. And then we talked about related to evidence that we would need to work with school districts around what types of evidence based on the professional development that they themselves are offering their staff, or that may be offered by ESDs or EPPs, what that evidence would look like. But we also talked about standardized assessments for those graduating from our EPPs would be, and actually for those currently in classrooms would be our first swath of folks to kind of be able to demonstrate their competency on the standardized test, recognizing that standardized tests are not an equitable and accurate assessment of everybody and everybody's skill sets and ability to demonstrate. So we talked a bit about, and you can see that some alternate ways that people might be able to demonstrate proficiency. And then we talked a bit about the new requirements for folks coming from out of state and the challenges that we decided to put the mobility compact kind of to the side because it has structural requirements around it that may create some difficulties. And so that's a conversation that needs to be had. And it's going to take kind of a deeper, longer conversation related to our continued work with the compact. And then we talked about with out-of-state licensees, concerns regarding the number of out-of-state licensees we have, largely due to the fact that we have a high number of folks finishing their programs virtually. So what we consider out-of-state licensees are people who get their licenses from another state, but that doesn't mean that they didn't do all their learning while they were sitting here at home in Oregon. And so how do we ensure that those standards are met as well? So you can see some of our reflections in there. Group, I'm sure I missed stuff.
Well done.
How about group one?
All right, I'll be sharing out for group one, and just as kind of Melissa shared as well, that as I go through this, you'll hear me multiple times mention the need for financial investments at different levels for this work to happen. So in terms of the requirement, we felt that all teachers will need to meet the expectation. And we, the concern with that being, it's really difficult to scale things up, and we need to make sure we have strong implementation plan for the EPPs, along with funding to support that work, and a strong implementation plan for ESDs and districts to support practicing teachers, and funding streams for that group as well. The one question we did have around this was just making sure we look into, and I think Kristen put a link in, that the tribal language licensed teachers that they're not impacted in a way that would have them leave that are ineligible for the work they are doing. In terms of when this should take place, we felt that newly licensed educators must meet this on their preliminary license, and currently licensed would meet the requirement on their next license renewal. And again, just funding for that professional development for the teachers to have opportunities to meet that practicing teachers before their next license renewal. When we talked about assessment, we talked about both a test and other measures given the biases in tests, but that the concern about who would determine if it was a portfolio or something, if it met it, and really the need for experts with literacy knowledge. So the people who are doing engage in the multiple measures, that there is a group of experts that kind of reviews that it's not just kind of one-offs. So we make sure it has that high standards of literacy knowledge. And we did have some outstanding questions about assessment that were needed before we could really address this in terms of some of the current assessments that are required by teachers in Oregon. And so that's an area that in terms of thinking about the specific assessment, we want to learn more about, and that it would be the same for initial teachers and practicing teachers, that they would meet the same standard.
Katie,
And then,
just
oh yeah.
add on the multiple measures, I'd had a question about it, whether that was available for all endorsements. So that is still something that we didn't really come to conclusions on, whether that would be available for the reading endorsement, or if it would be just an assessment, or exactly what, right?
Yes, yeah, we had there were still a few, we had some assessment questions that hopefully at some point the assessment expert for, I think, is it ODE, Kristen, that you had mentioned, could meet.
I was mentioning Shara Mondragon from TSPC. She supports multiple measures.
So just to learn a little bit more about that. And then in terms of the out-of-state compact, we felt that they would have 1 year to complete the literacy requirement upon coming in, so that they could get that initial license coming in, but then they'd have a year to meet the literacy requirements for the state of Oregon. And then again, just needing to, for this all to happen at the level it needs to happen, that funding support is needed. And I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
I just have a question that I'm hoping someone on the call can clarify for me. So when a candidate attends one of the out-of-state online schools, does that online school recommend them for licensure in Oregon, or do they get a license in another state and then transfer in through reciprocity? Does anybody know?
Great question. So right now, does someone else want to answer? Is there someone from HEC here? Okay, so right now there are two things that related to that. Sorry, something just emergency vehicle just went past and I almost just dropped right out of my brain what you were asking. Okay, so the first responsibility that is shifting is that out-of-state EPPs, virtual EPPs who are serving Oregon candidates need to inform them about the limitations that will exist in getting their license from out of state because the EPP is out of state. So they need to inform them about anything that they will not be completing. I guess a good thing would be Oregon history. Things as an example, right? Where they would still need to be doing additional work. So that's one piece, but then that's new. And then the second piece is you're right, Dr. Fritz. So they received their degree from that university and their license from that state.
Okay,
And then they apply for reciprocity from that license having been received, and then they go through a process here.
okay, that helps, because that, I think that makes a difference in that last question, yeah. Since we know so many candidates are coming to us that way. Yeah.
All right, anything else from group one? All right, so the general sentiment, and please correct me if I'm wrong, especially because I am coming late to this conversation, is that I know the original plan was for us to have some recommendations that we would vote on, but it seems like we still need a little bit more fleshing out of some of these details. Is that the general sentiment, that maybe we need to use our work session before our final meeting in June? I see some nods. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I think that's kind of where we're gonna go, is to use our June 7th work session to continue to flesh out all these great points that you all are brought up in your groups. And then we'll have our final vote on this then for June 17th at our final council business meeting. Okay.
That
All
sounds
right,
great.
I'm gonna hand it off to Co-Chair Fritz.
Thanks, Co-Chair Gardner. All right, so our final deliverable is around recommendations for an implementation timeline. Specifically, the executive order that created the council indicates that we need to develop a plan and timeline for the adoption and integration of these new program and licensing standards that will come from the Teacher Standards and Practices Commission. So that needs to also include a plan for building the capacity of EPPs and their faculty to implement that plan. So Pooja is going to provide us with a little bit of an overview of the document that was also included and the link that's embedded in the agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you, Co-Chair Fritz. So we had agency leaders really convene an interagency group convened by Director Ben Cannon at HEC, who wasn't able to be here today. So I'll just do a general walkthrough. I'll just go ahead and screen share this document just to orient you to it that was provided to you. This is essentially a set of implementation options. Those of you who had a chance to attend or view the recording from the council optional information session have already seen this. But we've sort of revised this based on the feedback from the work session. Again, because we don't make decisions there, but we're trying to use that to inform what you all wanted to see in the council so that you could deliberate within this setting and within the breakouts, and then come back and we could have a vote if you're feeling ready to do a vote. So essentially, it's intended to help us answer the question of how do we even begin to implement these robust recommendations? And of course, licensure conversation that you just had as a piece of it. You've talked about funding, obviously, and other sorts of infrastructure that are needed to make sure that these standards actually are implemented, but we wanted to offer you several questions to consider and some draft recommendations that you could possibly make or revise. So the first question is this question of by when, at what time period do we want the new expectations that you've set out in your educator preparation program approval standards? When do you want those new expectations? Because that's really what they are, is a set of new expectations for our education system. When do we want that to be effective? So there's a draft here around phasing in the OPP. OEEP stands for Oregon Educator Preparation Program, as you'll see throughout the doc. There's been timelines added to this based on the conversations that were had at the work session, and additional refinements. We are also having the staff team work on additional level of detail that will be considered in June. It's essentially a deeper dive into how this would all work. And we didn't want to overwhelm you just at this point with all of those details without first kind of getting a gut check on, is this the right kind of general sense? So that's the first question. The second question is, what is the support that Oregon educator preparation institutions need to meet those new expectations? So we're talking about, what are those new expectations? What are the supports that we're going to provide EPP partners to meet those expectations? And so that's kind of what's outlined here. And then the third question is, well, what are the supports that we need for Oregon educators to meet those expectations? Obviously, you've just begun to talk about that. And so the assessment questions kind of fit into this as well. And lastly, the question of, what are the state infrastructure and investments that are needed to create the conditions for the high quality implementations and for the expectations to be met? So we've tried to intentionally scaffold this conversation. So you're starting with, again, what are the expectation timetables? How are we going to support EPPs to meet that timetable? How are we going to support educators to meet that timetable? And then what are the structural conditions and investments we need to make everybody successful? So that's kind of the overview of the framework that the team, the interagency team, who have a lot of experience, obviously implementing multiple different standards and recommendations from advisory groups, just as this. So they've been able to put some thought together in that front. So we do have an opportunity to do breakouts, but I wanted to kick it back to you, Co-Chair Fritz, if you want to add anything more before we go into breakouts.
Great. No, I think we're good to go into those small group discussions. Remember that our goal is to really identify what we think is important in this phase of implementation. So go question by question, discuss the pros and cons of the different recommendations that are on this list, and think about which you'd really want to propose that the council adopt as those recommendations. And then the group should decide on a council member to report back your discussion to the group. And remember, do that first. Pick your person first, and then you won't run out of time. Kristen's going to put those instructions into the chat, and then we'll break out into those two groups.
Co-chairs, I'm just looking at our notes, and I'm wondering if we want to just debrief the group conversations. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we're good with that. I think we started with. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, do we want to start with group one this time?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Sounds good.
No, they have a representative to speak.
Is that us?
That's us.
Oh, okay. You want me to go? Okay, so when we discussed the timeline, and we as a group were all in favor of the timeline, it felt like we had a lot of members in our group who are in EPPs, and they felt like it is reasonable, so we felt good about that. Something to think about as a side note is that for the timeline of implementation is that whenever implementation does start, whichever candidates are in process in a program will still be working toward and held to the requirements that were the requirements when they started their program. So that was just a little bit of a side note. We talked a lot about a lot of things in terms of what EPPs will need to make to meet expectations. Funding, for sure. We talked about funding over and over and over, specific funding that would be protected for this particular work and nothing else. We talked about making available institutes, websites, kind of building a expansive resource bank, and that the need for that in terms of timeline would be pretty immediate, considering that the capacity building year would be starting in just a couple of months from right now. We talked about looking at other states for exemplars in terms of how they've done that, how they've done it, which states have done it successfully, and that we could potentially save time and money by borrowing some practices there. We had talk about implementation grant money to EPPs versus coordination of the professional development by TSPC. And that kind of merged into a conversation about maybe that isn't an either or this or that, this versus that, but rather kind of a partnership or a hybrid of both of those. Both of those things, implementation grant monies to the EPPs and also so some central coordination by the TSPC. We talked about the need or hope for really hashing out an implementation guide for the standards, which is something that we had talked about, particularly in the subcommittee throughout the months. And we talked about creating a database of which schools and school districts all around Oregon maybe already have educators with the training and practices in place that will make good placements for field experiences for EPP faculty and staff to visit in their capacity building years, and then also to be field placements for candidates with the new standards. For number 3, what do Oregon educators need? We said that we support the menu of options that was there in the draft recommendation. And then for number 4, we talked again about funding and really needing to have specific funding. And we talked again about money to EPPs and also some coordination from TSPC. There was talk about worry stemmed from the deep budget cuts that are happening in schools and districts all across the state, and the need to really protect the early literacy work with very specific funding. There was a question about, or a statement that in some other states, the states cover the cost of the literacy assessment. And so there's a wondering if Oregon could cover the cost for educators taking that test. There was talk about needing to increase capacity at TSPC, specifically with expertise in literacy. So potentially hiring a content expert or at least hiring a consultant to support a trusted expert with the content expertise. I think we did have a question about how detailed we needed to get it as a council in terms of recommended support from the state, and Kristen shared with us a document that the interagency group had started to work on, and said that we did not need to get too detailed, just whether or not we supported that draft recommendation, and we do. Did I miss anything?
All right. Do we have the representative from the other group?
Yeah, so I would say group 2 as well in number 1.
thought that that timeline looked where it could be done well and sort of the slow down to go and do it well. But we did kind of talk about messaging that just because there's a delay there doesn't mean the work isn't necessarily already being done at the current EPPs with the lessons the classes they've redesigned, and as well in districts that are already doing that. So it isn't like a standstill, but that timeline looked good to us. For the second one, what the EPPs, we talked a lot about what Group 1 talked about with funding. We also talked a little bit about the need for the awareness at TSPC to support the different models of how programs go through curriculum review. The example I think of Portland State, that it's like, or that it's the professors there they have to go through like 17 steps to change a course. So some of those higher level the institutions have different processes, and TSPC thinking like it can't just be a one size fits all. So some flexibility with supporting the EPPs in that way. We also discussed in that second one about the administrators as well, needing to make sure that coursework happens as well. I'm looking there about definitely we had a really good discussions about the roles of the ESDs helping as well in this area. So the more that we can do with the different agencies. Okay, so that was question 2. Question 3, what Oregon educators need to meet the expectations. We discussed like adding additional days, definitely funding. We discussed like one district is using their early literacy money to pay teachers at the curriculum rate. And so the teachers feeling absolutely valued for the work and time that they're putting in. And then also at the same time, it helps to support the EPPs. So the capacity of the EPPs to have different structures for teachers to increase their capacity. We definitely support that. And that choice for choice for current teachers is really helpful, depending on what their capacity is. In question 4, we did also talked about the money to support the grading support at TSPC. We discussed with the administrators partnering with COSA to build in some supportive strands that would support the administrators. Same with Oregon School Board Association to partner with TSPC. There was a lot there. I'm not sure that you captured everything, or if anybody else from our group wants to chime in. Our group also felt like this was really good stuff that was fleshed out here, and that we're ready to vote in our group. I think that there's some good recommendations here.
I think our group was also in agreement. We were ready to vote. And yes.
That's amazing. Okay. Should we get ready to launch some polls then, and we'll go question by question. Kristen, if you could do the screen share, and then we'll see who Zoom wants to give the launch poll access to today, me or Alex. Let's see who's going to be lucky. I think I'm going to be the lucky one. Okay. So essentially the thing that you're seeing here, is this question. Let me make sure. Yeah. Okay. So are we comfortable voting on this set of recommendations? Okay, we'll do fist of 5 vote for your support with, again, 3, 4, and 5 is really consensus, and anything less we would kind of have more discussion about. Let's go ahead and launch the poll. Hopefully you see that on your screen. I'm just confirming if there's 13 council members here, because that's who I have voted. Is there anybody that we're still waiting on? Again, staff are excluded. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll. Share results. So we've got here recommendation to proceed with this recommendation to question 1. Great. Stop sharing. And then Kristen, if you can go to the second question. Okay. I think did I get this right? Can you make the comment bigger? I just added this based on the share out, the show more button. There we go. So I wondered whether you want to add this to the recommendation or if you want to vote on it as it's kind of written in the doc. Shahnaz, I think you had shared this from your group. So what was your intention? Was it to be added to this recommendation?
I'm not sure. I was just reporting out. I don't.
Okay, that's fair.
I
Sorry.
think,
Well, is
I
it
think
the
we were-
only one that mentions funding?
no. No, and I
Protected
think those things that Shauna shared, were really just maybe other ideas. So maybe it does need to be added, not because we were looking at this as a menu of possibilities.
Yes.
So,
Yep.
yeah. So
Okay.
I would be comfortable with adding those in as other possibilities.
Okay. Does anybody disagree with the recommendation to include the things that you see in comment as part of the recommendation? No? Okay, so the second vote is going to be as if both are paired, what you see in the comments and the draft under question 2. So that's what you're going to vote on for the second poll. I think we're waiting on one more person. Okay, great. I'm going to end the poll. Share results, and we have consensus here as well. So far, so good. Let's see. Question 3 is noted here, recommending that we're ensuring all educators, including experienced teachers and graduates of educator preparation programs outside of Oregon, are supported and held accountable for meeting the high standards for literacy instruction. And everything you see below would be part of that recommendation as well. Any discussion or comments about this before we vote? No? We'll go ahead and launch the poll. Okay, I think we've got everybody again. And in the poll and sharing the results there. Got consensus there as well. Stop sharing here, and we'll go to the final question, which is around the implementation infrastructure. I heard a lot about investments today. We recognize those are necessary to be paired with these strategies. So I'm glad that you're thinking about it already. Any discussion or questions here? Okay, let's go ahead and launch this last poll. One more person needs to vote. Any last holdouts here? There we go. All right, we've got everybody. We're going to end the poll, share results. And I know that some folks have to drop off, so thank you for joining us as long as you have. While we had quorum, looks like we had consensus on all the 4 implementation recommendations. So excellent job, everybody. We know that there's more work to do. And as mentioned earlier, the interagency leadership team is kind of working together on a deeper dive plan that will be ready to share in June. So that will be coming. All right, I'll hand it back to you, co-chairs.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone. I think we really did make a lot of progress today. I know in my room, we had some really great discussions and some good ideas coming out. So we're excited to see what this next step might be. Our next meeting is a work session on June 7th. And then we'll have our final official council business meeting on June 17th. So I think we all need to be congratulated today because we made some good headway. With that, I think we're done early.
Yay.
The gift of time.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.